So we move to what we term as types of nutrition. In this, we want to look at the ways different organisms actually obtain food. Of course, food is utilized by the body in different ways, but primarily the food is actually broken down into simpler molecules, and these molecules are now absorbed into the bloodstream, where you will have some of these nutrients being metabolized to provide energy. Some of this energy, some of these foods can actually be, nutrients can actually be stored or converted into other useful molecules that are needed by the body. So our concern in this presentation is to see how do they obtain the food before we look at all those processes. So we start by looking at a scenario where you have a learner who has set up a freshwater aquarium with green algae, fish, and some snails. Okay, so you're having living organisms in an aquarium. So this basically is like an ecosystem. That's a word that I'm introducing, but you can basically check out what it means. You have an interaction of organisms with their non-living environment in a self-sustaining way. That is what we call an ecosystem. So the non-living component of the environment in this aquarium, we have the water, okay? And then the water is non-living, we can all agree. And then, of course, you should be having nutrients, because if you don't have nutrients in that aquarium, you could not expect life to be there. Okay, so that means that we have inorganic food nutrients there, that again is a non-living component. But of course, you also have an element to do with light, because if there is no light, I don't think this algae could actually be able to carry out photosynthesis and therefore be alive. So that means that there's an element of light in this. So those are non-living components of the environment, and they support the living component, where we're having the snails and the fish, and then also the algae. Now, what we are going to see in this scenario is that there is a relationship between the organisms here. How are the plants depending on the snails and the fish? And then how are the snails and the fish depending on the algae? What type of relationship do they have? What feeding types are there? And of what importance are some organisms that are saprophytic in nature in this kind of aquarium? So perhaps by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer those questions. We broadly categorize nutrition into two, based on where organisms actually obtain their food from. If organisms make their food through the use of sunlight energy or any other form of energy, then we say that is autotrophic nutrition. They make their own food. That's the point. But if they don't make their own food, but they obtain that food from other organisms, they will say that is heterotrophic nutrition. So let us look at the details of these two types of nutrition. So the green plants are able to make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. And we know that actually photosynthesis requires sun energy. And that sun energy is captured by chlorophyll that is contained in the leaves. And definitely there should be carbon dioxide for that to happen. And that's when you get sugars. And the sugar that we are making here is basically the food. Okay? And then when it comes to the other organisms, they will be obtaining the food from the plants. So that means that the plants, or basically the green plants, because they're the ones we are terming as phototrophic, or we can call them autotrophs. They are the ones that make the food, and then other organisms depend on them. So we said that green plants are actually primary producers. But again, remember that it's not only the green plants that we know, but also the algae can actually carry out photosynthesis. Okay. Again, some bacteria can also do that. Some bacteria can actually be autotrophic, but the difference with them is that for them they use the energy that they get from oxidation of compounds, and we shall look at that shortly. So we can divide the autotrophs, or we can have two types of autotrophic nutrition. That's one, photoautotrophs, and then two, chemoautotrophs. Or to differentiate between the two, we are looking at the source of energy. Where is that energy coming from? For the plants, if that energy is coming from the sun, and then for the chemoautotrophs, they are basically oxidizing chemicals and getting that energy that is required. So they use chemical energy. So that is, it can also be termed as chemosynthesis. So the nitrogen fixing bacteria fall under this category. So we move to heterotrophic nutrition. With this, the organism obtain food from other organisms. Okay, so they obtain already made food. So we can term them as heterotrophs. Okay, so this include animals, fungi, some bacteria, and protists. Okay, we have what we call holozoic nutrition. This is when you have an organism that has a complex digestive system and takes in the whole complex food, digest it, and then absorb the nutrients that are required. And that is basically internalization. So most animals have this, and we can have carnivores, organisms that feed on other animals. Okay, so we can have carnivorous plants also. By the way, these are plants that can actually derive some nutrients from organisms, okay, like insects. Okay, and then we have what we term as herbivores, these animals that feed on plant material, the cows, the rabbits, and even sheep, goats, and the rest. Omnivorous, this one can feed on both animals or flesh and plant material, or plants basically. So we have humans there, and then the bears. Okay, so what you have on the screen is an amoeba that is actually feasting on some organism, and that is typically what heterotrophic nutrition is. But again, this is holozoic nutrition. The whole complex organism is actually going to be digested, and then the required nutrients will be absorbed. Saprophytic nutrition, remember dead organic matter. These organisms feed on dead decay matter. Okay, so they are very, very important in the ecosystem because they help in the cycling of nutrients. Otherwise, if we don't have these saprophytes, then it means that nutrients will not be recycled. So they are quite very important. And then the third type of heterotrophic nutrition is what we call symbiotic nutrition. So with this, we have two species that are involved in a nutritional relationship. So we have feeding relationships, and we are going to see what are the types of symbiotic relationships, because they are also quite a number, depending on whether the organisms both benefit or they don't benefit, or whether one benefit and the other does not benefit. Okay, so let's look at them. We have commensalism. With commensalism, one species benefits and the other is not affected. And this is what you can see in the fish called ramola when it gets attached to the sharks. So what happens is that as this ramola fish is attached to the shark, it can increase the opportunities of getting itself food, and the shark will not feel any impact related to it. And then mutualism is when you have both organisms actually benefiting. Mutual, if you say mutual, both are benefiting. So mutualism is when you have both of them benefiting. So it's the same that we see in the gut, where we have bacteria. Even humans actually have bacteria, and some of this bacteria is actually very important because it helps in absorption and different immunological function. So that's why they are beneficial. Okay, and then for them they benefit by obtaining the necessary nutrients that they actually need. And then we have parasitism, where you have one organism benefiting and another getting harmed in the process. And that means that the organism that is feeding on the other is the one we call a parasite, and the organism that is being fed on or that is harboring the parasite is the one we call the host. So that relationship is what we call parasitism. And we can have, for example, a plant in here that is growing on another plant. You can see that that definitely is parasitic. Okay. So in the aquarium, you have autotrophic and heterotrophic nutrition. The nutritional relationship between the algae and the fish is that
snails and the fish also depend on the green algae for food. Okay, so that's quite very important. The green algae are photosynthetic, and therefore we definitely call them producers. And these snails and fish are actually consumers. So without the algae, the fish and the snails could not have food.
The algae definitely photosynthesizes and produces oxygen as one of the byproducts of photosynthesis, and the fish would actually need this oxygen for respiration. Okay, but as a result of respiration, you will have carbon dioxide produced by the fish, and this carbon dioxide will be used by the algae in the process of photosynthesis. So that means that you have interdependence. Okay, the green algae depends on the fish for carbon dioxide, and the fish depends on the algae for oxygen. That's the relationship that you have there. Can you describe the importance of including both autotrophs and heterotrophs in a closed aquatic system? That's basically the same interpretation, that if you have organisms that produce their own food, we term them as producers. And when you have producers, it means you have food that is available for other organisms that are in the category of whether herbivores or even carnivorous organisms, or even omnivorous organisms. All these actually depend on producers, which are the green plants. And in this case, we